How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 245 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode I'm covering a listener's question, and it's probably a topic that has been covered across various episodes on the podcast over the last little while, but it's coming at it, I suppose, from a different angle and maybe pulling a few sort of previous episodes together in order to answer this question for the listener. Before I get into that, what a change in a week. As I record here tonight, it's quite cold outside and it's absolutely lashing rain. Whereas last week we had that lovely sort of surprise of a week of really fine, dry, warm weather that felt like something we'd be happy to get in July or August. And yeah, it was lovely to get that last week, but certainly back to reality today with the cold and the wet. It's In general, though, there's still, the outlook for weather is quite good. So there's going to be loads of opportunity in terms of planting bulbs and everything. So there's, everything is probably as it normally is at this time of year. So it's all good and certainly a lot drier than where we were this time last year. So yeah, great opportunity over the next few weeks to do stuff. Um, Flowers really have only come in, the likes of dahlias and stuff have really only come into their own in the last couple of weeks. And hopefully, as I say, the weather stays kind of steady so that we can get some enjoyment out of those before we start to see any kind of frost kicking in over the next few weeks. So to get back to the question, so it's a question from a listener called Caroline, and Caroline has a small garden and hopes to move over the next couple of years. And she starts off by saying, "Hi John, wondering if it's a good time to take cuttings. Not really sure of the difference between hardwood and softwood. And the general idea is that this small garden is not, the garden that she's going to be in for forever. She's looking to move at some stage. Don't think there's any kind of dates around that or when that might be. But the fact that she's looking to move, she's looking to build up the stock of her own plants, by propagating herself, so that when she does move, she has these plants to just transfer across to the new garden whenever and wherever that is. So she says she loves the podcast, that they're very good for her, that I give good contextual type information that suits her and that helps her in her own garden. And that is, of course, the aim always of every episode, to give you something that you can take away and use in your own garden. That's the idea, that's the plan. And great to hear from people that it is helping them, in various shapes and sizes. And yeah, as I say, that's the aim all the time. So the question, I suppose, is kind of a few parts to it, but we'll go through it. The biggest thing is it's so easy now to propagate your own plants, to produce your own plants, to multiply your own plants. And it's not always work that you have to do on your own either. And I'll sort of explain what I mean in a minute. So essentially, in a small garden, you already have, certain plants. You've mentioned some euphorbia, hyssop, fuchsia, clematis, some hedging type plants like hazel, uh, dog rose, those type plants. And so you have certain amount of plants there already. Some of them are quite small, you mentioned, and you're trying to build up a stock that you'll be able to move somewhere else. And I suppose there's loads of ways to do it. So when you talk about propagating plants, there's cuttings, which we'll talk about in more detail. Within cuttings, you have hardwood and softwood. There's probably a few more. There's leaf cuttings and root cuttings as well. But just for the purposes of this, to keep it simple, we'll just talk about cuttings and we'll talk about softwood and hardwood. Layering is another good way. We'll go into that in more detail. Division is a great way, and this is where I'm saying you don't have to do it all on your own. So division is basically where you get perennial type plants, which is what Caroline wants to build up stock of, is more perennial type plants. So perennial type plants, you plant them in, they expand and they get bigger, they widen at the base. And then for two reasons. Number one, to increase the vigor of that plant in that position, you divide it. So basically that means just splitting the plant. You dig it up, you split it. Sometimes you don't even have to dig it. You dig it, you split it, and you pot it or you move it somewhere else. And that increases the vigor of the plant that's left there. And also it gives you the opportunity to create a new plant somewhere else in your garden or in a pot that you can be moved later. And when I say you don't have to do this on your own is if you have friends who are gardeners or friends who have gardens or family members and they have things like astilbes or hostas, they will be more than happy for you to come and divide those because it's going to increase the vigor of the one that you leave for them. And then you have a free plant essentially. So that's why I say this doesn't have to be all of your own production, all in your, own time consuming way. This can be really, really simple and really, I suppose, fruitful in that you can gather a lot of plants quite quickly. So that's the vision, and that's a huge one. Seed, I know Caroline has tried this, and seed is a brilliant one when you're doing, when you're looking to build stock of perennials, because it's a really, cost-effective way of producing perennial plants really easily with a very small amount of effort and very cost effectively, as I say. So packet of seeds, sow them in the autumn time. From that packet of seeds, maybe get 10, 15, 20 different perennial plants of whatever type that is. You pot them on at a later stage. You have 20 pots now. They'll grow on. Next spring, particularly, you'll see a burst of growth. You generally move them up a pot size at that stage. And then all of a sudden you have 20 plants which are ready and strong enough and healthy enough to go into the ground outside, all from a packet of seed that you started sort of 6 months earlier. The only thing in relation to that in a small garden is that it is or can be, take up quite a bit of space. So there may be more effective ways, for example, division. And then other forms of propagation are things like budding and grafting. And definitely, budding and grafting is used widely, but I wouldn't be considering that for Caroline's situation. That's very much advanced stuff and you're looking for specific plants. So this is not what Caroline is trying to do. She's trying to build up a stock of perennial plants, maybe some flowering shrubs and things like that. So her useful propagation methods are going to be cuttings, layering potentially, division, and seed if the space is available. Even in relation to the seed, again, your family members or people in other gardens, or if you're in gardening groups, they can be useful as well because a lot of perennials will produce seed heads. Those seed heads can be saved, this time of the year. You want to be doing it when the weather is dry, saving that seed, sowing that seed in the coming months, and then next year you're going to have your plants. So there's loads of ways of doing this, and it is good to have, gardening friends, gardening allies, family members who have gardens, and then from that you're able to harvest plants basically that you'll be able to move on. So to get kind of specific on it, Caroline said she's not sure on what a hardwood and a softwood cutting is, and it's really, really simple. The phraseology kind of tells you what it is. So a softwood cutting is soft tissue, stem tissue of a plant that has basically, it's not woody at all. So it's basically that green, fresh growth, not woody, and that's a softwood cutting. Now, softwood cuttings are typically taken more or less in summertime up to, you kind of get away with it up until September, early September. And it tends to be a lot of perennial type plants, even a lot of flowering shrubs on the very, very new growth. And, if you're looking to increase perennials by cuttings, it's typically earlier in the summer that you will do those. Principles are the same. You take a cut of a plant directly below a node. You remove any bottom leaves. You use rooting powder or gel, whatever it is that you're going to use if you want, not essential, but if you want, and you put it into a compost or a growing media that's mixed with some form of grit or perlite that has aeration in it, because roots, in order to develop, need air, moisture. And that's basically it. And what you do up on top then is you cover it with some form of plastic or polythene. You keep the humidity high on top, and that allows the roots to develop down below. Because if you picture taking a cutting in that summertime period, if the plant is transpiring up on top, it'll basically dry out that little small cutting really quickly. So you reduce the number of leaves up on top, cover it down, increase the humidity around that top part of the plant, ensure the root zone doesn't get too wet but stays moist all the time. And eventually, over a couple of weeks, quite quickly, once the temperatures are warm, you will see root growth. That can be then potted on into another pot, and away you go. You have a new plant. And that's softwood. And typically with perennials, some flowering shrubs, and typically done in the summertime. Hardwood, then, on the other hand, is exactly what it says. It's the harder wood. So it becomes a woody type material. Typically, that's not used at all for perennial plants, but it is used again for a lot of flowering shrubs, a lot of hedging type plants, and it's used at this time of the year. And so you do it in September, October, and then you leave them over the winter, and by next spring they'll have started to form new roots. It's a less finicky way of doing it. There's probably, in terms of Caroline is looking for particularly perennials here. So in relation to perennials, it's not going to be, there's not perennials that you can do like this really, but you can definitely do flowering shrubs like this. So again, the same principle. You're looking for a hard piece of wood. You're looking for something no thicker than kind of your little finger. You cut directly below a leaf node, and just to describe it, a leaf node is where the leaves come off the stem. So directly below that, at a slight angle, you cut with a good sharp secateurs. Make sure your secateurs is clean. You remove those two bottom leaves. You look for a cutting that's kind of maybe sort of 10 to maximum 15 centimeters in length. Again, dip it in rooting powder or gel. And again, stick it into a growing media that's mixed with horticultural grit or perlite that gives it good aeration. You water them, and then you put them somewhere where it's going to be shaded, kind of away from elements. A cold frame is really good for this type of thing if you have one. If not, just a sort of a shaded, sheltered area within your garden behind a wall or something like that. Not going to need much sun. You don't need to cover them down overly either. It depends on where you are, but generally speaking, you can just stick them into a good sized pot, and then you leave them. Keep an eye on them that they don't dry out at any stage over the coming months or into the winter. And then next spring, you should be able to check by lifting the pot. Look underneath. You should at that stage start to see roots coming out through the holes in the bottom, little white roots. And at that stage, you're forming roots inside. And typically at that stage, that's good then to be potted on into a bigger pot. You can put several cuttings into the same pot initially. So you could have, a pot with a diameter of 10 or 15 centimeters. You could put 4 or 5 cuttings into that, no problem. And so you can get a lot of cuttings into a small space. So that's a kind of simplified version of what a softwood and a hardwood cutting is. But in relation to what you're specifically looking to do, Caroline, where you're looking to build up your perennial stock, then the timing is just not right on that. You can do things like, at this time of the year, rosemary, all of the kind of flowering shrubs typically that would have woody growth can be used at this time of the year. You mentioned fuchsias. You'll typically be able to get a bit of hardwood growth from your fuchsia and take cuttings from that. And the one thing I'd say is that timing periods for these are, they're given as guides, but it's of no cost to you to try it. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. There's no big deal. If it works and you get plants off it, great. So don't be afraid to do a little bit of trial and error. And, with different microclimates and changing weathers and all the rest of it, there's nothing to say that you might not be able to get some established outside of the normal windows of what we traditionally say is the period for doing something. So don't be afraid to experiment. And if it goes wrong, there's no harm done. It's just a pot, maybe 10, 15 minutes of your time. So it's no big deal. But I think the big one in terms of building up perennial collection is, and in your situation, is the vision. So if you have anybody who has a garden, anybody who's, family members, be watching every time you visit, have a peep out the window, see what you see, and ask them, can you divide? For example, a hosta can be divided, and a astilbe can be divided. Irises can be divided. There's so many perennial plants. Rudbeckias are in flower at the moment. They can be divided. There's so many perennial plants that can be just divided easily. And it's not just of benefit to you who's getting free plants from it. It's of benefit to the plant that's left there because it reinvigorates them for the following year. Sometimes the clump becomes too big and there isn't enough in the ground for that clump. So by dividing it, you freshen up the growth, you freshen up the plant, you rejuvenate the plant. So it's of benefit. So you can sell it that way to your family member before you go in digging and cutting their plants. So yeah, that's for me, that would be what I would be looking at from your point of view, who's looking to create perennial type plants, particularly at this time of the year. That's a very, very good way of doing it. And seeds then obviously is another great option. But again, just to be conscious of the space requirement after you sow your seeds. So as I said, perennial seeds can be sowed at this time of the year. A bit earlier would be more beneficial, but you're still okay at this time of the year. And they'll slowly germinate over the next couple of months. And next spring, they'll be able to be potted or pricked out and potted on into a slightly bigger pot. Probably get one more move then, typically around April time, and then they can go outside come next kind of June or after the first frost next year. So a really good way of doing it again. But again, if you're on tight on space, you might not want to go that seed sowing route at the moment. The other ways of creating plants and one's multiplying plants in a cost effective way, which is what Caroline is looking for. If you look again at this time of the year, looking at things like bulbs, they're going to naturalize. So naturalize means that they're going to multiply. So if you get, for example, just a basic tete-a-tete bulb, if you get that and you, I suppose, pot that into a pot. So you put 10 bulbs in, by next summer, you're going to have 15 bulbs in there. You let it flower again, you let it come to fruition again, and again the following year you're going to have double that again. So that's going to keep multiplying, and that's a really good way. And then when you move to your new garden, whenever that is, those 10 that you initially planted could be, depending on time frame, could be 20, could be 50. So another great way of doing it. So naturalizing bulbs is what you're looking for there for that multiplication. And then the other way of increasing perennials is a lot of the bulb companies will do bulbs or corms or roots of a lot of perennials. So things like astilbe, while a fully grown astilbe plant, in your garden center next summer is probably going to be, kind of €10. If you get the corm or the root of one at this stage of the year from your bulb suppliers, you might get it for kind of €2.50, €3. You just pot it into a pot, leave it over the winter, and next spring that is going to grow up. And now all of a sudden you have a new plant. That new plant can be planted somewhere or into a bigger pot. And again, maybe kind of 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, that can be split. So now your singular plant becomes 4 plants over a kind of a 2 to 3 year period. So there's multiple ways of doing it, but it's a really good way to start building up stock. I think as I said, the ways for you that will work best are division, cuttings to a certain extent, and seed sowing. Another method that's quite good, and it's not that tricky to do, but it's important to understand it, is layering. So layering is essentially where it's basically like doing a cutting, except you don't remove the cutting from the mother plant. And an example of that would be if you had, for example, let me think, a lilac tree, you would, along one of the kind of decent sized stems, something about the thickness of your finger, you would go to a leaf node again. So where there's two leaves coming out, you would take off those 2 leaves, you would scratch the bark down through the layers on one side, just on one side. So about a third of the circumference around, you would scratch off the bark, and you would scratch it a couple of centimeters above and below the node. Then you'd get a bag, plastic bag or a polythene bag with your growing media in it. And again, we're looking at horticultural grit and some kind of growing media or perlite and growing media. You wet that, moisten that, and then you wrap it all around the stem of that plant and you tie it off top and bottom. So you're creating a bag of soil or a bag of growing media right around that exposed cut that you've just made. Now it remains on the mother plant and you haven't cut off the outer layers. So that plant is going to be able to continue to send nutrients and water up. And over the next while, that will start to root. And if you're using a clear polythene bag, you will see the roots developing over time. And when that bag is fully kind of formed with roots, you just cut it off directly below the bag. And now you have a completely new plant with a root zone and all. And that's a very, very good way of doing it. So that's air layering, where it's done off the ground. Another way of doing it is ground layering, where you could do the same thing by pinning one of the bottom stems to the ground and putting that cut directly onto the ground, and it'll start to form roots downward then. So again, a really easy way of doing it. You would need to have the plants yourself, or again, use a family member who has, you know, good plants in the garden that you want to replicate. But there's loads of ways of doing it, and I think yeah, you know, for you over the next couple of years as you look to build up stock, perennials is definitely a good way to go. Flowering shrubs is a good way to go, and you can use the methods I mentioned there. So I hope that kind of helps. Glad you're enjoying the podcast. Glad you're getting something for it, and looking forward to seeing how you go with these propagation. Again, don't be afraid to try things. If you try it and it doesn't work out, or if it's not the correct time of year by the traditional recommendations, don't worry about it. Have a go. If it doesn't work, no problem. You can try it again in the correct period the next time. It's really easy. Someone worth following, you know, for that type of advice. Anya, the flower fairy, she was on the podcast, you know, probably 6 months or a year ago, and she has just released a new book, The Money Saving Gardener, and that's all about basically propagating your own plants, and almost every plant in her garden has been propagated by herself. So she's worth checking out from that point of view as well. And yeah, that's this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.